Thank you, Luboš, for the very nice words. It's a great honor to talk here. And in the last couple of years, I've been giving a whole bunch of speeches. But since I had a free rein here, I decided I'm sort of getting tired of giving speeches. I'm going to go back to my day job and actually present a paper. I'll warn you, it's a theory paper, but in Europe, there actually still are a few theorists, unlike the United States. And I looked at the program. There's a bunch of financial intermediation theory. There's a bunch of corporate finance theory. So some of you will actually be entertained by this. And my apologies to the rest of you. So I'm going to present a paper joint with Yunja Hu from University of North Carolina and my long-term colleague, co-author Raghu Rajan. And it's a paper about financial development, which I'll define in a minute, and various types of financial development. So the short and long of financial development. So this is sort of limited pledgeability, which is sort of very commonly used model in like the macro finance stuff, and something with demand for liquidity in long and short-term assets. So this is sort of a marriage between those two forces, and it turns out there's some interesting stuff that comes out. So what do I mean by like a low financial development? So there's a lot of like policy discussion, people at the World Bank, OECD, lamenting the fact that there's not tons of long-term financing available in a bunch of countries with weaker financial development. And then there's work that sort of shows in these countries with less long-term financing, the term structure of actual investment, real investment, is also short. And the various, I've taken shots at this in the past in terms of like illiquid markets and things like that. But probably the most straightforward way to think about that is that there are some conflicts of interest or some problems that lead to financial constraints that are somehow different for short-term investment than in long-term investment. So another fact that seems to be true in these economies is that the economies with limited financial development and not much long-term financing, if there is finance, it tends to be short-term finance toward like relatively simple projects. Think about dealer inventory for textiles, or their near-term receivables, or very short-term trade credit. So we'd say that if we think that that's somehow not just a fluke, we could imagine that because there are fewer conflicts of interest, those are more pledgeable to outside investors, so you can raise household finance from households, consumers I'll call them in the model, and that's less of a problem than raising it for machinery or manufacturing or something more complicated than that. So give a sense of how the model works. Long-term investment is fundamentally more profitable than short-term investment. I think that's probably reasonable. But as I just mentioned, it involves more difficult to resolve conflicts of interest, so it's less pledgeable. You can commit to pay outside investors a smaller fraction of the return of a long-term investment than a short-term investment. So if you imagine there was no pledgeability at all, you couldn't commit to pay any of long-term investment, then long-term investment would have to be financed exclusively by internal funds. We'll call that producer capital, and you couldn't use external funds at all. So if you could pledge a little bit of it, you could pledge 2% of a long-term thing and 80% of a short-term thing, it's quite possible that the long-term investments you could finance only 2% of wouldn't be undertaken at all, and it would be more profitable as a firm to move your real investment to short-term stuff, that you could finance it from the outside, and it will turn out, since you can only finance 80% of it, there are going to be some rents associated with that, and those rents might be bigger than using long-term investment, than taking long-term investment that you had to largely self-fund. So what's going to happen, the way the model is going to work, is there going to be something called short-term pledgeability, the fraction of a short-term project you can commit to pay outside. Something else called long-term pledgeability, the fraction of a long-term project. And the key things I'm going to talk about today, there's some other stuff going on in the paper, stuff I'm going to talk about today is suppose the only policy intervention you have as a government is to raise or potentially lower the long-term pledgeability, and separate from that, the short-term pledgeability. So it's not just raising pledgeability, there's going to be a relative something going on as well. So I don't have wonderful evidence that these things are all related to short-term and long-term, but in terms of thinking about what kinds of things that we think of as short-term pledgeability, these are like credit development. Did some work with the World Bank in the 90s. They were talking about these things. Improved transparency of payment system, reliable warehouses, so you can tell when somebody actually delivers goods. I mean, this is sort of like what Amazon Marketplace is like in current day stuff. Collateral registries, which also have some advantages in long term. More rapid ability to foreclose on payables, accounts payable. So all of those things you could imagine changing laws or institutions or getting private organizations to do these things better. Those are going to be improvements of those. We're going to call that short-term pledgeability or credit development. I'm actually going to call it short-term pledgeability just so it's not totally, I could say some of this stuff under oath. So long-term financial reform, we'll call that financial development. So that's sort of like usually the kind of things that the people think of in the literature as encouraging equity financing. But also bankruptcy and reorganization laws, you can make those things more efficient. That's going to have a much bigger impact on long-term finance than it is on like trade credit and things like that. Corporate governance standards, corporate governance laws, fraud laws, accounting standards. So those are the kinds of things we think about as improving long-term pledgeability. Okay, so those are examples, but they're just going to be 2 parameters for the rest of the talk. So we're going to talk about the private production of financial claims out of real investments. So we assume in this model the financial sector, the private sector creates all the financial claims. It's a real model. Private producers, people we're going to call producers, are creating these private financial claims to be held and traded by consumers who are also the investors. There's not a separate consumer or investor in this thing. They're going to be consumers/investors who are going to turn out to have a demand for liquidity. And these real investments are going to be undertaken with the capital of both producers and consumers. And there's going to be a parameter for the fraction of the capital that comes from producers versus consumers in the endowments. So I'll tell you the timing in a minute. So implicitly, we're aggregating financial intermediaries together with producers. We could have the intermediaries repackage claims produced by producers. We don't really have much to say. There's nothing like fancy monitoring going on, any of that kind of stuff here. So we're sort of just getting down to the net amount of pledgeability from whatever source. And we're imagining that there's some kind of public collective choice that can change these pledgeabilities. Okay, so only, this is in case you don't know what pledgeability is, only a fraction of total output can be pledged to consumers. There's all kinds of micro-foundations, incentives, private information, complicated production, not observed outsiders. Bernanke and Gertler is a great example, Hart and Moore, Kiyotaki and Moore, several Kiyotaki and Moores. So as you sort of know, once you have these financial constraints that constrain the allocation of surplus in the future between producers who have to get the non-pledgeable part and consumers who can just get the pledgeable part, there could be rents despite perfect competition because you can't commit to pay out more than 100% of the pledgeable part, but that could still leave you with a rent from the non-pledgeable part. So rents are going to influence the supply, the production of financial claims, and also the equilibrium composition of real investment. So that's standard pledgeability stuff. So now some standard or slightly simplified standard stuff on demand for liquidity, which is another reason that short and long-term stuff differ. So consumers are uncertain on how long, when they want to consume. They're going to be 3 dates, 0, 1, and 2. They might want to consume on date 1, or maybe they're just indifferent between date 1 and date 2. So they have a Diamond Dybvig type liquidity shocks here. And unlike Diamond and Dybvig, we're going to assume everybody has linear utility, but that's a later slide. So short-term claims have special value to consumers for two reasons. One, having a claim that matures on the date you want to consume is a good thing. So that's a nice thing about short-term debt, short-term claims. There's also the second thing we'll call dry purchasing power, that you'd like to have some liquidity around to, even if you don't need to consume, if you find there's some good investment opportunities around, having some liquidity around to invest. So there's going to be some long-term assets that will be resold in secondary markets. If those are sold at low prices, offering high rates of return, the higher that rate of return on buying resold long-term assets, the more value you will have in owning liquidity and short-term assets. So there's sort of a complementarity in the demand for short and long-term assets. So that's like the first paper, sort of thinking of it as Charlie Jacquelin's paper, my paper in '97. So there's this dry purchasing power is important, an essential part of the model going on today. So the interaction between this liquidity demand with limited pledgeability is going to make a big difference. Okay, so those are the ingredients in the model. Important assumption here is that all producers, there are many producers, they're small and there's a continuum of them, but only producers, not consumers, have access to two constant returns to scale investment technologies, one short-term and one long-term. And producers can create financial claims out of the pledgeable portions of those real investments. So production uses capital at date zero. The first constant returns to scale technology is short assets. You put 1 unit of capital in at date zero, you get capital R units of date one goods at date one. There's also the long asset. You put 1 unit of capital at date zero, you get X bigger than R units of consumption at date two. And the fact that X is bigger than R says like long-term investment is more productive than short-term investment. Okay, we don't put rolling the things over. If you had to roll them over, and then you could get a two-term return from shorts of rolling over R squared. Instead of doing that, we just do something like diamond and divvy. You'll see something in the preferences. But you could, the model's the same if you just change those units. Okay, so there's this thing, short-term and long-term pledgeability. So they're just parameters. Gamma S is the fraction of short-term investment you can pledge. Gamma L is the fraction of long-term investment you can pledge. Okay, so for this, I'll do the example of short. If you can shorts return R in total, you can pledge a fraction gamma S of that. So for per unit of initial investment, total investment at date zero, the most you can pledge to consumers is gamma S times R. Okay. Now, that also leaves 1 minus gamma S times R as a potentially a rent, which they may or may not pay for, to producers. But at least that much has to go to producers. More could go to producers. You wouldn't have to give 100% of the pledgeable part to consumers. But no matter, if you wanted to give them as much as possible, you got to give at least that 1 minus gamma S. So that's standard thing about limited pledgeability. And similarly for long-term stuff, gamma LX and 1 minus gamma LX. Okay, it'll usually be the case, and it's a lot of our results, we'll see the results depend, some of the funky results depend on this. It's important that gamma S be greater than gamma L. You can pledge a bigger fraction of the simple short-term stuff. And when gamma S is a bunch bigger, a lot bigger, interesting things happen. Okay, almost done with the model. So the ratio exogenous rate, this is endowments at date zero, the ratio of consumer to producer capital is lambda. So producers are measured 1 and each has 1 unit of own capital. That's goods at date zero, that's capital at date zero, inputs. Consumers are measured lambda, each has 1 unit of own capital. So just if most of the initial capital is in the hands of consumers, lambda is way bigger than 1. Then pledgeability constraints matter a lot, because almost all the capital is going to come from consumers. On the other hand, if almost all the capital comes from producers, pledgeability constraints basically don't matter, because let's say you're the producer, you put in 90% of the capital, you can only pledge out 70% of the return. it's not a problem. You can still, the financial constraint, the pledgeability constraint wouldn't be binding. Okay? So I'll just re-say what I just said then in a little more precision. So if producers have no capital, lambda approaches infinity, then it's going to tell you that short financial claims, if produced per unit of production, give a return, a total rate of return, a gross rate of return of gamma S times R. And longs give gamma L times X. Okay, that's because all the capital is consumer capital, there's no producer capital. So all the capital comes from them, you just give them what you can give them, that's an upper bound on the rate of return they can offer. And then in this economy where it was essentially almost all consumer capital, then producers would earn these rents per unit of production of 1 minus gamma S times R, 1 minus gamma L times X. So, obviously if producers have limited capital, it's not zero, then these rents that I just mentioned, the 1 minus gamma L stuff, and perfect competition are going to end up driving the real investment decisions as well as the types of assets, the financial claims that are created. So like I said on the previous slide, if producers have almost all the capital, then competition is going to eliminate all the rents, right? You got 80% of the capital, you can pledge out 70% of the return. Competition is going to force you to pass through the full rate of return, X, on long-term claims. There's some different stuff going on in short-term claims. We'll get there in a second. Okay, so preferences. I mentioned that there's not funky risk aversion. Everybody has linear utility here. Producers really don't give a damn when they consume. So their consumption is the sum of their consumption at date 1 and date 2, C1P plus C2P. Now each consumer might get a liquidity shock and need to consume early. So they'll be early with some probability and late with 1 minus that probability. But this linear utility, we're taking out one of the key things from Diamond Dybvig. We can put it back in. The results are a little more complicated, but all the same results are true. We're taking out the idea that the people who consume early have a really high marginal rate of utility. They're the poor people who really care about consumption. People just care about, the linear preferences here. Okay? So your consumption, if you're early, depends on date 1 consumption. If you're not, you don't give a damn. You're like the producers. Okay, so there's a market at date 1 where long claims are going to need to be traded, right? Because these people who are early have no use for them. People who are late are willing to buy them. They're not willing to pay too much for them because their utility depends on C1 plus C2. They'd never pay, 20, let's say these were nominal, they'd never pay 20 euros for a claim that returned 10 euros in the future, but they'd be willing to pay up to 20 euros for a claim that repaid 20 euros in the future. Okay? So in equilibrium, all the early consumers will sell all the longs to the late consumers. Late consumers will pay up to 1 unit of date 1 consumption for a unit of date 2 consumption. Okay, a miracle occurred and the equilibrium is. So when you look at the equilibrium outcomes, which are all the possible ones, and I'll talk about when these actually occur in terms of things you could think about measuring, in order of increasing long pledgeability, increasing gamma L, holding constant the short pledgeability, gamma S. So gamma S is some number between 0 and 1. For this example, it's not going to be too close to 1. The gamma S is also going to be sort of low, but that'll become clear in a couple of slides. So suppose gamma S is some number, not too close to 1, but above 0. Then if gamma L is low, we'll have a short dominant case where all of the assets, real assets, are short. Nobody does any long production despite it being available to be used with producer capital, producing exclusively short claims. So that's short dominant. This is some of the stuff that World Bank people and OECD people are complaining about. We're going to get an interesting case where a lot of the funky stuff goes on in this model called short glut. There's a glut of shorts. Producers produce a few long-term assets, but most of the production, because of limited pledgeability, is in shorts. So the typical household has a portfolio of 90% shorts, 10% longs. In equilibrium here, short and long claims offer consumers the same rate of return over both horizons. So Taking a long and selling it early gives you the same return as holding a short for one period. Holding a short and then buying a long in the interim period gives the same return as holding a long to maturity. Okay? So that we'll see that how that one, what's going on, the trade-offs that occur that cause that one, cause some interesting stuff. The next one, if we raise pledgeability of long stuff a little bit more, we get what we call illiquid longs. So now, two things happen. One, in that short glut, longs and shorts offered the same returns. Once we get more pledgeability, we get to a more normal situation where long-term financial claims offer higher rates of return held to maturity than short-term financial claims. So investors are going to choose their own freely chosen portfolio of longs and short financial claims. Once you get to this region, longs are going to end up offering higher long-term two-period claims are going to offer higher return than one-period claims. If they resell in the market, so let's say you turn out to be early and you need to resell the thing early, it's going to sell as an illiquid asset. It's going to sell in the market for less than the value it is worth at date 2. So there are going to be some bargains available at date 1, which is going to increase the demand for holding short-term assets. And for all these first three cases, short dominant, short glut, and illiquid long, they're going to be rents to producers. Producers are going to get a higher return than if they took their own capital and invested it optimally across long and shorts. Since they don't give a damn when they consume and longs return early, the no rents outcome, if they have 1 unit of capital of their own at date 0, gives them a return of X. So for all of these three, they're going to get a rate of return above X because they're going to earn some rents on creating financial assets. Okay, if we raise gamma L, the pledgeability of long stuff, even higher, we're getting close to 1. Doesn't have to go all the way up to 1, just get close to 1. Then we're going to wipe out the rents. So the producers are just going to get a rate of return X if they have initial capital of 1. Consumers are going to get a long rate of X. They're going to be all full pass-through of the returns. And there's not going to be any rents earned by producers for short-term or long-term production, as we see. And why do we care about this? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what happens when we change short-term or long-term pledgeability, the gamma L or gamma S respectively, within these regions, and to do the comparative statics with respect to gamma L and gamma X. Then we're going to come back, I hope, and interpret when we're going to expect to see these different regions. But for right now, first, I'm just going to do comparative statics. I'm not going to tell you too much why they occur. We'll come back and talk about why they occur. Okay, so here are the comparative statics with respect to increasing the pledgeability of long-term assets, increasing gamma L. So the headline up there is that effective improved long-term pledgeability depends on its current level. Short glut, the second case, and illiquid long have opposite implications on who gains and who loses. Those turn out to be the most important and interesting ones, and we'll see when one of those can occur and when one of those can't occur. Okay, suppose you're in the short dominant range. So it's just that short financial claims, gamma L is so low, they just can't compete. Gamma L is so low that long financial claims can't compete with shorts. Right? So you can put all the producer capital, all the consumer capital into shorts. That'll give a rate of return above, to households, to consumers, above gamma SR, above the pledgeable part of the short. Why? Because only some of the capital going in comes from consumers, some of it comes from producers, and the pledgeable part of the producer capital can go to consumers. That's pretty standard. So raising gamma L a little bit when shorts are dominating longs, that doesn't do anything because you're still at a corner basically. So the local effect of raising long pledgeability, if you're in this really hopelessly underdeveloped case of short dominance, it does nothing. Okay. Now, if you're in the short glut, if you increase long-term pledgeability, it hurts consumers and helps producers. It's a little weird. You give producers the ability to pay out more from an asset, and there's perfect competition. Somehow that's going to help them. Okay? But I think that it's reasonable, once we see why this is, it's reasonable that that happens. Once we get more long-term pledgeability, so we're in the illiquid long case, and we don't have this glut of short-term assets, but long-term assets and short-term assets are competing on a fairly normal, equal basis with each other in the financial market, then increasing the pledgeability, the ability of producers to pay out more, is going to help consumers and hurt producers. And when there are no rents and you're passing all the X through anyway, you're giving the full rate of return on longs, further increasing pledgeability doesn't do anything for anybody. So the interesting thing is comparing the short glut and the illiquid long. One of them, increasing long pledgeability, helps producers, hurts consumers, does the opposite of the illiquid long. We can also look at a thing called delta longs. What fraction of real investment goes into longs? Total real investment at date zero goes into long physical assets. So in the short glut, increasing pledgeability increases that number. In illiquid longs, it decreases it. Thank you for turning that back on, whoever did that, thank you. Because I don't know what the next slide says, I haven't memorized all this. We could hold this up. So one of the reason basically that I assume the linear utility here, the main results don't depend on it. Like the equally weighted social welfare function in this thing essentially is just the fraction of long investment. Long investment is just more productive. Households might need their money early, might need their money late, but their marginal utility doesn't move around. It's like a total surplus kind of thing. So delta longs is also a measure of social surplus. So increasing long pledgeability here in the short glut thing is good for social surplus, bad in the illiquid longs case. Okay, we'll come back, and I didn't tell you why yet. So now we're on increasing short pledgeability. Increasing short pledgeability always helps consumers. So here I can sort of tell you why. Shorts are less productive, right? R is less than X. The only people who care about early consumption before date 2, who give a damn, the only people who care are consumers. So producers really want total surplus. They don't care whether they get it at date 1 or date 2. So if you increase the pledgeability, if you allow consumer capital to be deployed more effectively in producing shorts, that's going to lead to a more efficient allocation of capital, and that's going to give a higher rate of return to households, to consumers. And in taking the rents, the extra profits out of producing shorts that the limited pledgeability leads to, increasing gamma S reduces those rents, that's going to hurt producers. In the short glut region, whether that increases or decreases long production, there's basically an income and a substitution effect. It could go either way. If I had time, I could tell you where in the region it comes on, but I don't. But in all the other cases, raising short-term pledgeability, even though it hurts producers here, it basically has no effect on producers here, but it helps consumers. Why? Because we can more efficiently put the consumer capital into shorts, which allows us to put more of the producer capital into longs. Okay, so I got two comparative statics there. Consumers always like short pledgeability because they like liquidity, and that's increasing the rate of return on liquid assets that end up in equilibrium. Producers are more conflicted, and the only time I'll put it in terms of consumers. The only time consumers are hurt by increased long pledgeability, the only time they're hurt is in this short glut case. So we're going to do a political economy thing. We're going to look at a democratic government or planner or whatever who puts a lot of weight on household welfare, and see how in these different regions what that government or planner who puts a lot of weight on household welfare would do. It's sort of a political economy theory of how these gamma S's and gamma L's change. So again, the only time consumers are against to improve development is improved gamma L, long pledgeability, in the short glut case. Producers strictly gain in that case, and producers basically don't like it or are indifferent in other cases. Okay, so when is the short glut or the short dominance case possible? Okay, so here is a key result that will help explain why the result is true. So I'm going to call two types of return comparisons: aligned returns and misaligned returns. Misaligned returns is when the pledgeable part of shorts, gamma S times R, the return on a unit of capital put into shorts, is bigger than the pledgeable part of longs, despite longs being more profitable overall. So the profitable investment is less pledgeable here. So if that's not true, if returns are instead aligned, that the pledgeable part of the profitable investment is bigger than the pledgeable part of the less profitable investment, if returns are aligned, then short dominance and short glut can't happen. So the only time, it's not if and only if, but the only time that you can get into this weird thing where consumers are hurt by an increased ability of producers to commit to pay out return to them, the only time that they're hurt is when we have these misaligned returns, which turns out to be when we have low financial development. Both the gammas are low, and they're particularly low for the gamma L versus gamma X. So here are for an example, a description of all of the regions. So gamma L on the x-axis, gamma S on the y-axis. So if they're both really close to zero and close to equal to each other, if they're ever sort of close to equal to each other, we're going to get the illiquid long rents or the no rents. When gamma L is very low and we start to raise gamma S, we're either going to get all shorts, the short dominance, or we're going to get this funky short glut case where there's a mix of longs and shorts produced, but they don't have differential returns. So what the previous result basically says is there's a line you put in there that divides that's sort of the pledgeable, along that line, the pledgeable part of longs, the pledgeable rate of return on a unit of capital put into longs equals the pledgeable rate of return on a unit of capital put into shorts. So once you're to the right of this line, these weird things over here can't happen. When you're over on this side of the line, where the weird kind of things can happen, these happen only if producer capital is not too big relative to consumer capital. Remember, if the producers had almost all the capital, the pledgeability constraint wouldn't be binding because they could just put up, whatever number I said, they could put up 60%, they could put up 90% of the capital and pledge out to pay 60% so that these pledgeability constraints would not bind. So the idea is that we're only going to get this opposition by consumer-oriented governments to increasing pledgeability in the cases where both the long and the short pledgeability are low, and we're in this sufficiently big difference between gamma S and gamma L that we're in the misaligned case. So to say that again, misaligned returns, unless there's abundant producer capital, consumers lose for increased loan pledgeability. And here's sort of why. Because short real assets offer greater pledgeable returns than longs, more long pledgeability allows producers to substitute their initial production toward the less pledgeable asset. Because when we're in the short glut case, why did we only have a little bit of short-term production? A little bit of long-term production. A lot of short-term, a little bit of long-term. Why? Because producers had a hard time, once the pledgeable part of shorts is bigger than the pledgeable part of longs, they had a hard time giving consumers as high a rate of return on longs as shorts because they're naturally less pledgeable. So you'd have to put disproportionately more producer capital into longs to get them to be able to just be a tie in rate of return with shorts. Okay? So it's basically, even though the non-pledgeable part of longs is clearly bigger than the non-pledgeable part of shorts, you can't get a set of assets available to consumers that consumers are happy with and willing to hold the longs. Maybe you can do a little bit of that, you can't do much, but you raise the pledgeability of longs, it becomes easier for longs to compete with shorts. Producers move capital from the short asset to the long asset relative to consumers, lowering the return on short assets, which ends up lowering the return on long assets and lowering the rate of return available to households and making producers better off. Okay? So this increases, but consumers are hurt by this, but it's good for social surplus. So in all cases, I said before, increased short pledgeability will increase consumer returns, and with, I told you why before. Okay, with aligned returns, those first two cases can't happen. So either for aligned returns or when there's tons of producer capital, so the financial constraints aren't binding, then increased pledgeability at either maturity increases consumer welfare, reduces producer rents and producer welfare, consumer interest favor improvements in all types of financial development. Once rents are eliminated, so you either have the gammas very, very high or there's not much consumer capital that needs to be raised. Increased short pledgeability continues to help consumers and doesn't hurt producers. And if you thought about this conflict of interest on which way in political economy we would choose to do financial reform, once you're up to the level where rents are eliminated, everybody's in favor of financial reform. And it's good for producer surplus, it's good for consumers, it's good for total surplus, and there's less of a disagreement. Okay. So the political economy of financial development. So this is still things I can say under oath in the model. I can't say the first one. The first one's an assumption. Democratic governments weigh consumers more than oligarchic. So this is just, say, whose welfare are we going to put more weight on? So when returns and pledgeable total return and pledgeable return are misaligned, the pledgeable part of shorts is bigger than the pledgeable part of longs. A financial development trap can occur when a consumer-oriented government won't want to raise long pledgeability. Okay, and that's not great for social surplus, but this is not so much. We're not trying to do a welfare analysis here. We're just trying to say predict that if you get into this thing where you have misaligned returns, then raising long pledgeability is going to be opposed, unless it's going to do nothing at all, unless we're in the short dominant case, consumers are going to be against improvements in bankruptcy laws for corporations and things like that. And an extreme misalignment where shorts dominate, raising long pledgeability doesn't do anything, right? Because locally, shorts still dominate. So consumer-oriented governments may try to look out for consumers and raise short pledgeability, but this effectively locks in low profitability real investments and low financial returns. I'll take something that's a little bit, you could say with one finger crossed under oath on the next page. That's when I go out of the paper mode into the speech mode, about how this has something to say about the sequencing of financial development. So in all the other cases, except this one when we have limited producer capital and returns in total are misaligned with pledgeable returns, the less profitable one is more pledgeable. In all other cases, improvements in either type of pledgeability will help consumers. So the general thing, if we could just say anything without putting too much spin on it, economies with low and misaligned financial development, have reforms that have very different effects, both redistributionally and on social surplus, than those that are either aligned or have very large producer net worth. Okay, so a little bit of speech right now. So these are things that are almost surely true, but in the model, there's no sequencing, there's no dynamics, or there's not much anything going on in this model. So let's try to if you use the model to think, what are the, this is a very simple model, it's not quantitative or anything, so this is like a framing way to think about these issues. So one of the things you hear a lot about in the financial development literature is the optimal sequencing of reforms. So the immediate effect of some reforms will affect the subsequent impact of other reforms. So you're going to change one gamma today, and then at some point in the future, you're going to, without committing to do it today, you're going to choose to make some other second change in the future. So suppose one increases short pledgeability when shorts dominate. So that's the only thing that has any effect immediately, because if you raise long pledgeability a little, shorts are still dominating. So you're going to raise short pledgeability a little bit. That's the only reform that does anything. And when I was doing some work with the World Bank, there was a gentleman there named Jerry Caprio, but not Larry. I think he's at Williams College now, who basically said, this is the theory of learn to walk before you learn to run. Because don't worry about your stock market, don't worry about your bankruptcy laws, don't worry about all this fraud stuff. Clean up the short-term financing, make sure trade credit is available, make sure few of the bankers are not crooks or something like that. And that's really, that's the most important thing. So if you think about this model, says that's the right thing to do in terms of having an effect. But if you think about this in a sequencing sense, that's actually pretty bad, because the reason that longs aren't being produced, real and financial, is because they can't compete with the high rate of return that's offered from shorts if you put producer and consumer capital in there. So if you increase locally, you increase the pledgeability of shorts, that's going to increase the hurdle rate that longs can't have to compete with when they couldn't compete today. So you could imagine if you raise gamma S a little bit, it's going to make it hard in the future to make longs be competitive, to get either into the short glut case or into the illiquid longs case. And it may be, if you actually were thinking you really wanted to get long-term investment, it would actually be more useful to lower gamma S, lower the hurdle rate, that's going to hurt households, transfer physical capital into longs, and this is like sort of similar to financial repression. So if you don't tell them you can't pay households anything and just take the money and give it to the producers, I mean, that would produce lots of investment. It probably wouldn't be very popular with the consumers. But sort of a nuanced version of that is at least don't learn to walk before you learn to run. If you think you might be wanting to run a marathon at some point in the relatively near future, because you'd sort of have to qualify for the Boston Marathon. I don't know what the fastest marathon is around here, Berlin maybe. And therefore, thinking dynamically says you need to think more about this. So that's just one example of thinking inside out, using this model as a view of the world. So we hope this is sort of useful for you to think about it. This is early stages for this. The first time we've given this paper, I've given this paper. But we're still thinking about what it means. Turns out there's some interesting stuff that goes on that's a bit more complicated when you put in the risk aversion, but all of these things I talked about, the comparative statics on the gammas in these regions and the effect of aligned and misaligned, they're all still true in that model. So thank you very much, and apology if you're not a theorist. So I hesitate to ask this because people don't tend to ask questions in theory seminars, but if anybody has any questions, I have time, all the time in the world, up to 14 minutes and 47 seconds to answer those.
Hello, Doug. Thanks a lot. That was a very insightful presentation. I was wondering if we could also think about consumers being consumers of potentially output, and investors being having financial claims. And in that case, the design in financial development would depend a little bit on the judicial system, and arguably the gammas would be different for output and for claims, financial claims.
So it is the case that the consumers do consume the output. They just can only consume because of essentially the pledgeability and what I call a budget constraint. They can only consume the pledgeable part of it. So if there were, I'm trying to think how to incorporate, I think if the government was thinking like that, that would effectively say, I care more about total consumption rather than household consumption. That'd be like increasing the welfare weight on producers. So, I mean, clearly, since these effects are part of these effects are social surplus, part of redistribution, the more weight you put on producers, you're going to get a very different. Suppose you put all the weight on producers, right? Then what you do is you take the money, you take the resources from the consumers, you give it to the producers, they produce longs, and the consumers starve to death. With linear utility, that's not so bad. That doesn't happen when suppose they have they're diminishing marginal utility. There's like an audit condition. You can't get that. So but then what you do, if you put all the weight on the producer, almost all the weight on the producers, you give like 10 billion to the producers and 11 cents to the consumers, but a lot of it is on early date 1 when they have a high marginal utility consumption. So I think the way we have the model, I can't quite address the point that you have.
Thank you, Doug. Very interesting. I think this model reminds me of the debate or maybe trade-off between narrow banks and fractional reserve banks. Because, after any financial crisis, for example, last year, people talk about maybe we should have more narrow banks, which can still provide payment service, short-term credits to support the short-term demand. But people also argue that if we have too many narrow banks, that's going to hurt long-term growth, right? Because going back to your 1983 paper, we know that fractional reserve banks are going to obviously take advantage of liquidity transformation. It's going to help with growth. So I wonder to what extent your model here can help us understand that trade-off, especially long-term series, when we're going to have more fractional reserve bank, when we're going to have more narrow banks.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. Let me parse it into pieces to see if I can figure out a good answer. So in some sense, the narrow banks are the short-term stuff here. It's the less profitable and more pledgeable thing. So in some sense, we have, if you don't do regulation, we have narrow banks just outcompete the wider banks here in the short dominant, and they have the narrow banks have most of the market share in the short glut. So if you imagine regulating, so instead of here's a way to think about it. Instead of changing the gammas, suppose you could directly, as a government or a regulator, tell them, put your money in the short, put your money in the long. Take the choice between short and long assets out of the household front. Then that you could get to a regulation like that. Now, it depends a lot on what the social welfare function is here. It's sort of going to be pushing you toward the other, this model is going to push you the other direction since the longs are more, in this case, more productive. It's going to say, hey, we're not going to let you have much liquidity. We're going to put a huge tax on short-term stuff, and we'll get more production. It's going to hurt the consumers but help the producers. So we don't allow that to go on. We're imagining this is all decentralized. So that's the second sort of, I don't have an answer, but that's a second related. The third thing is, since we're only allowing claims to be created out of the pledgeable part of things, we're sort of not allowing anything like liquidity creation that goes on in Diamond Divig. And the reason we don't is because there's a doesn't have to be perfect, there's a secondary market here for these assets. So like the stuff that Charlie Jacklin wrote to shut down the liquidity insurance in Diamond Divig is already here. So we're imagining if the government can't stop trade in these assets, then there's nothing the banking system could do that the markets here can't do. So those are three answers. I think it does have something to do with narrow banking. I guess the thing about pledgeability is, the thing about the last point I made about the banks creating liquidity is the banks are then, in Diamond Divig, they're creating stuff out of the non-pledgeable portion on the hope that somebody comes in and refinances it. We don't have anybody to refinance here. So you could imagine saying all you can borrow is the pledgeable portion. That would be like forcing things to narrow banking. That would be very stable. In fact, some of the things on this learn to walk before you learn to run stuff that the World Bank people were talking about is say, let's clean up the banking system and just rely on the banking system for all finance. So cleaning up the banking system really makes them look more like narrow banks. So, but I don't, other than those four random thoughts, I don't have any. So that's good. Good, I knew the answer to those questions. I was afraid I'd get one I didn't know the answer to. Great, thank you very much.
Well, I would like to thank Doug for his deep thoughts on financial development. The topic of financial development is particularly important here in Europe, where there's plenty of room for development in both capital markets and markets for the financing of early stage ventures. So I'm sure there will be others building on your basic research in this area to develop various applications relevant to policymakers. It happened in the past. I'm sure it's going to happen again. So thank you. We have a small token of appreciation for you.
Oh,
and many thanks again. So thank you.
Thank
Doug.
you. Thank you, Luos. Thank you.